I clicked accept, and is it arriving? No, it's not. I'll try to reload. Clicked accept.
Hello, everybody. I'm really glad to have you all here for the third kind of lecture within the November festivals and the November talks. This year, the first time in Vienna, due to the fact that our chair of Urban Design, Institute of Urban Design at here in Vienna, in collaboration with the Sto-Stiftung, will launch 4 lectures and a third one today. And I'm really happy to have him here. Will be Alberto Veiga. He was the first one, I have to admit, kind of who came up in my mind when we launched this idea of having 4 talks around the topic how architecture is choreographing urban space, or kind of really offices that work on the interface of this common ground between architecture and public space. And like Alberto already mentioned in the introduction, in an interview we just did, kind of to put the public in front and to put the public always kind of on the first line of work, their work, and how they address architecture, and how architecture is really, let's say, going in a dialogue with the city and its context is for them really important. Alberto, I'm happy to have you here. Unfortunately, this time we have to do it online due to the lockdown in Vienna. But I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Alberto studied in Navarra and is teaching on several kind of and lecturing on several universities, among the university in Venice. And like I said before, I have the luxury, let's say, or we as an office here, working really next to a building. Kind of Alberto will also kind of present tonight, which is for me a really very interesting example of how a building can add really a completely new dimension of public space to the city, linking several kind of levels of the streetscape to the waterfront, introducing certain terraces that they bring in connection, let's say, office spaces, dance kind of school that is in the building itself. Dance has a lot of cultural aspects, but also linking to schoolyards and even to the waterfront as such, and bringing, introducing a new public space, an outdoor space to the city, which I think is an enormous, let's say, this is really great work. And I'm really curious how Alberto will talk today about around the topic of the palimpsest, about the approach he and his partner have to, let's say, how they address different kind of buildings and how do they integrate this into the urban fabric. Thanks a lot. I'm really happy to have you here, Alberto, and I will hand over the word to you. So, and I also like to engage everybody kind of that's listening to the YouTube channel now. Really post your questions in the YouTube channel because we are happy, and also Alberto kind of to discuss these points afterwards together with you. Thanks a lot, and handing over to you, Alberto. Thanks a lot having you here.
Thank you. Thank you, T. Hi. Well, as Ute said, it's a pity not having the chance of attending this lecture in person. I mean, and exchange with all of you in Vienna. But well, anyways, I think that it's a great opportunity for me to talk about this idea of the relationship between architecture and the city. Because it's one of the issues that really has shaped the way we understand architecture in our own practice. Our practice, well, is based in Barcelona, and we started the practice 15 years ago. And since the very beginning, this idea of how the architecture needs to relate with the city, how the architecture needs to look back to the city, and how the architecture needs to provoke somehow the recover of the idea of public. It's something that really has, as I said, shaped the way we work. The words I'm going to show you today, I'm going to show you 3 buildings that we probably some of the most important, but I think the best examples that I found in order to explain clearly these ideas related with the city, related with the public space, and related with the responsibility of architecture from our point of view, of course, nowadays, in terms of how to relate with this word public. So I'm going to share my screen. As Sudha said, as I am you, I mean, I know that I'm conscious that this is not assigned to do a lecture online, but I mean, I am you to do after the lecture, ask many questions as you want. I mean, try to activate a public discussion about what I'm going to show you today, but all the ideas that you can have in mind in order to at least try to escape from this online feeling somehow, and exchanging ideas and conversation after the talk. So I'm going to share my screen. I've used this word palimpsest as a way to put a title to a lecture, because palimpsest somehow it's a word that defines clearly what you find when you arrive to a place, to the city center of any European city at least. And this idea that there is a mix of elements, a mix of things that is going always around the places where you work, and that you try to discover or rediscover when you start to provoke somehow architecture. Somehow, when we work in, or at least in the places that we have had the chance to work, we always try to rediscover or to recover the essence of the places where we work. We really believe about the uniqueness and the singularity of all the places where we work is what makes sense for us as architects when you can work, mainly when you can work abroad. You know, when you approach, like in this case, to Chur in Graubünden in Switzerland. I mean, this idea that you need to approach to the site trying to rediscover the essence of that place. Somehow this idea of rediscover the essence of a place when you work within the city is just to rediscover the city somehow. I know that sounds very naive, but this idea of rediscover somehow the places where you work and rediscover the city is something that we really always put in front of all our discussions when we do a competition or when we do a design, when we have the chance to do a design. In this case, in KUR, I mean, this was a competition that we did in 2012. And the brief basically was suggesting doing the extension of the Fine Arts Museum, which basically it was this building. I mean, this is the Villa, the existing Fine Arts Museum. I mean, the Kunsthaus. I mean, which is a very well-known building, basically because it was refurbished by Peter Zumthor in the late 80s. The main interventions were probably, I mean, this winter garden that we're looking at here, and on a small bridge connecting an over historical building at the back of the Fine Arts Museum. That was, I mean, one of the elements that somehow we had to maintain. And this villa, which it was a villa that was part of the city, of course. I mean, it was in the city center, and basically was a building characterized by certain elements, I mean, surprising elements somehow. I mean, when you first approach to a site, I mean, you start to see things and start to feel things. And in this case, I mean, this villa was surrounded by this kind of elements, no, like this, I mean, this couple of sphinxes at the entrance of the villa. Or, for example, the interiors were interiors, let's say, surprisingly decorated or ornamented, let's say, with many, many influences. Now, the reason for this is that this building, placed in this city center of KUR at the heart of Switzerland, was basically the former villa of a man that made his fortune basically traveling around the world, you know, traveling, doing his fortune in Middle East. And in the late 18th century, he decided to build this house, Villa Planta. And the house itself somehow has its own identity within the city. The house itself responds to its own character. And thinking about how to react within the city, we always used this reference. We knew that we had to do the extension. We had to somehow extend the building, but at the same time, we needed to find our own character, our own attitude within the city in front of the existing building. We like the reference. I mean, this Piero Francesca portrait of the Duchesses of Montefeltro, Federico and Battista, because I mean, it's a painting that explains clearly this idea of attitude or complementarity somehow that we were looking for with our building. We wanted to have our own identity within the city. We wanted to have somehow the same attitude, but we wanted to be complementary. And that's something that became the main topic of discussion during the designing process. I mean, had to have our own character showing the same attitude and being complementary within the city. This is the ground floor of Villa Planta. I mean, somehow it's a building from the latest, the second half of the 18th century. A building that was, let's say, interpretation of this building. No, and I can't say that it's a copy, but well, it was influenced by Villa Rotonda, by Palladio. No, I mean this idea of strict sense of geometry, the idea of the sequence between the spaces, somehow this rigor or this strictness that defines clearly the architecture. This was one of the tools that we used in order to do the extension, which is the building that you see at your right side. Somehow the building, in order to establish this link with the existing, uses the geometry as a tool to define clearly, I mean, language, let's say. We wanted to use somehow, and we wanted to activate this link with the existing using, I mean, this idea of geometry as a bridge between both buildings. You know, I mean, the idea of working within the axis of the existing building, the idea of compose somehow in a very strict way a volume that could define somehow the extension of Villa Planta. But that's just about the language. That's just about the way we understood in this moment architecture, our own obsession somehow. But that was not, I mean, probably the main reason to do something. I mean, the main reason for us was basically what appears here. No, this is Villa Planta. Villa Planta was a building surrounded by a very nice public garden. It's a small public garden that surrounds somehow and wraps the building. We wanted to provoke somehow the same reaction around our building. We wanted to generate a small public space that could activate somehow this gap in between both buildings, could establish somehow a kind of distance between both, because we wanted to have our own character, but wanted to have the same attitude, let's say. And we wanted to establish somehow, let's say, a bridge between not just Villa Planta, but the other buildings that were surrounding us. Now, this idea of being within the city and try to establish a link between the office building, for example, the housing buildings on the back of this picture, and Villa Planta was one of the main responsibilities of the building. So it was not about finding a good relationship with the villa, with the museum. It was about establishing somehow this invisible link between all the scales of the city, and doing that just within a small public space. It was more like, it was a statement, no? Then can be perceived as a minimum gesture in terms of square meters, but that declares clearly the character of the building, and declares clearly the importance of this gap in between the pre-existence, the extension, and the other buildings. The brief of the competition aimed the competitors to use as much as possible the entire plot of the ground to link physically both buildings, keeping the existing bridge done by Peter Sunter at the late 80s. But we knew somehow that it was more important, this relationship with the city, this relationship with the persistence, and this idea of splitting both buildings in order to preserve this idea of public in a better way than keeping somehow and using all the plot as the brief was describing. And that's why basically we decided to reduce as much as possible the public volume over the ground somehow, just keeping, I mean, the main public uses, I mean, the foyer and the pedagogical classrooms, I mean, on top of the foyer, and trying to move, I mean, the main core of the program, I mean, the galleries, under the ground. The idea of moving them under the ground was risking in terms of how to develop the project. was because we wanted to put in front, as I said before, the public space surrounding the building and this relationship through the public space with the villa that was in front of us. And that's why the building appeared like a simple volume, a volume defined just not by its dimensions, defined by the relationship with the others. Almost a pure cube that appears in the center of this composition, and that understands the program in a, let's say, a challenging way, moving the program, the galleries, and the technical uses to the basement in order to preserve this relationship with the city. And of course, linking the building at the first basement physically, but linking the building somehow conceptually too, because this idea of the public space surrounding the architecture. When we took these decisions, basically, then the way to develop the building was a natural consequence of these topics. I mean, when you enter to the building, to the foyer, I mean, you discover Villa Planta as the preexistence as the main reference. The building almost frames the view of the building, declaring somehow the importance of the preexistence, declaring that we are just a second layer in this place. And starting from this point, I mean, the building suggests a way of moving around the underground levels in the same way than the preexistence, understanding geometry and the sequences of the spaces in the same way, trying to get somehow the same feeling inside the extension as the visitors are going to feel at the former museum. So basically, I mean, this language, the language that we use, this tool of geometry, somehow appears after making these first decisions of how to relate with the public space, how to compose another fragment of city, and using this idea of geometry somehow to provoke an extension that can have a link, a physical link, or an intellectual link with the former, with the Villa Planta, let's say. So you can see here how we use the same idea of sequence of rooms. I mean, how the geometry appears in a very strict way, how we use the cores as the elements that are organizing all the technical needs and all the flows through the building. And basically how the galleries are just exploring how to get a good proportion, a good scale, and a good lining. This is basically the fundamentals that we use most of the times. No, we used to joke saying that we are just architects, and these are the tools that we use: scale, proportion, and light. This is the link, the staircase that takes you to the basement of Villa Planta. And this is the floor of the temporary galleries at the second basement, where, well, the space appears in a more free way. I mean, just keeping the course and provoking somehow a good background for the artworks, because, well, this museum understands that the galleries are backgrounds for the experience of the artwork. So we were not trying to impose somehow an element that could compete with the artworks inside the building. Of course, well, as I said, this is the outcome somehow of the designing process. I mean, how the building appears in relationship with the villa, understanding this idea of public space, this idea of geometry, this strict sense of somehow geometry that took us to this kind of language. But that was not enough in order to establish somehow a conversation with the building. And we use somehow outside another tool that we thought that could be useful, I mean, in order to provoke reactions or to provoke, let's say, conversations with the citizens, that would be to use somehow the facade, the way we understood the facade as a way to provoke this kind of dialogue within the city. Basically, we were surrounded by these orthogonal shapes, by these textures that were rooted somehow in the nature of the office building or this housing block that you're looking at here at the back. We wanted to use somehow something linked with them, but we wanted to use it in a way that could establish a different conversation. The ornament, because it is an ornament, appears in the facade as a link with the current, with the former Villa Planta, with the existing museum, to use the idea of ornament as a way of thinking, but at the same time, to use the ornament to give depth, to give texture, to integrate elements, to work with the concrete, but to provoke somehow reactions to the visitors that can take somehow the lecture of the context and the lecture of the building as a piece of concrete beyond these facts. Probably trying to understand this element as a more autonomous element, as an element that can be understood even without this physical context of core. The ornament, in this case, the facade, the work with the material, tries to provoke somehow this lecture of the building as an independent volume that can have meaning within the city of Kur, but can have meaning by itself too. It was an attempt to rediscover somehow where's the balance between, there's a classical discussion in architecture, where's the balance between doing something that belongs to a place, belongs to Kur, but at the same time belongs to all places, or belongs or becomes an independent element, let's say. So this was a good sample for us in order to how to relate with the city at a certain scale. Just looking at this specific plot and this specific, let's say, this singular space. Well, as I said at the beginning, we always work in singular spaces, and to rediscover this uniqueness and this richness within the city is one of the main, I would say, the main tasks of an architect. And a good sample for me of this idea, it's this competition that we did in Lausanne, in Switzerland too. And this was a competition almost at the same time than the museum in Kur. Some months before, perhaps. In 2011, we were doing not really just the Fine Arts Museum of Lausanne, but for the master plan of the Fine Arts Museum, the Decorative Arts Museum, and the Photography Museum of Lausanne. It was a very ambitious competition, which basically proposed to reuse this building that I'm highlighting here at the bottom of this image. Basically, these were the old warehouses for the maintenance of the trains in Lausanne. By the way, this is Lausanne, with the train station at the left side, and the train tracks dividing the city in two. And we had to somehow use this warehouse and to reinvent this warehouse as a new building for these three museums. This was basically what the brief was describing. So we had a persistence, this complex of warehouses, and we had to somehow transform them into a composition of three new museums. Basically, during weeks, we were working in this side, without reflecting about the city. Just thinking about the master plan, thinking about the museums, trying to understand how to transform this building, the persistence, in something that really could be understood as a good museum. With a representative element, and that could be integrated within the city. It's true that we didn't find somehow an argument. We didn't find really a proposal that could somehow combine this idea of representativity this idea of how to understand a museum of the 21st century in this place, trying to rediscover this place, and trying to integrate it into Lausanne as a city. There is something that I always explain when talking about this museum, and it's the first visit we did to the site with all the teams of that were participating in the competition. And basically, this was a private place at the city center of Lausanne. I mean, this was a plot that was owned by French company of Switzerland, and this was a private building. So it was a place that nobody knew somehow. All of us were discovering this place the day of the visit, discovering the scale, discovering the position of the place, discovering the values and the qualities of the place, and trying to somehow understand it just for the first sight. So there was a moment during the competition that this was the red line is the plot somehow that we could use in order to place, I mean, this master plan with a warehouse that we had to refurbish or transform. There was a moment in the competition, the process, that we tried to find references. And this is one of the references that this is real, let's say, because we used it during the competition process. That was basically, well, this is the reference of the Uffizi galleries in Florence, where basically, I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if saying that this is a public space defined by a museum, an art gallery, or this is an art gallery defined by a public space. But we wanted to achieve something that could be understood with this strength. We wanted to provoke public space that was defined by three museums, or three museums defined by a public space. But this word again, this expression public space, became the engine of thinking of the competition, of the design process. And that's why we decided to just compose the best public space that we could. At the beginning, forgetting about the preexistence. I mean, so we decided to demolish the preexistence because we thought that it was more important to think about the city and to think about this site and to rediscover this site than just the fact of keeping the physical building that the brief was proposing to maintain, and thinking about how to preserve somehow the idea of the building in a certain way, but not keeping the physical fact of the building, because that was obliging us to react within the city in a way that we thought was not the right answer. We weren't interested about provoking or proposing an object. We wanted to propose a building that could, as I said at the very beginning, could look back to the city, could react within the city, putting the city as the main actor always, and not putting the object as the main actor. So somehow we used to say that we wanted to propose an iconic public space. And this is why, well, we compose somehow this public space, this simple public space, through these three simple architectures, three pieces of architecture that were defined in a very simple way. This is the Fine Arts Museum, I mean, which is the building that we developed. The other two are recently have been finished by Iris Mateus. I mean, is this part of the plot, which was during construction at this moment. But basically, the elements that are composing this master plan are three elements that are engaged just with the fact of defining a good public space. and trying to compose with them just a kind of background, a natural background for the public space. The buildings are elements, in this case, the Fine Arts Museum. It's a building that just provokes or appears as an environment that protects from the train tracks this public space, establishing the better conditions for this public space. And of course, the better conditions for the fact of having a fine arts museum inside, but trying to establish a good scale, protecting from the dust, the noise, establishing security measures in order to protect the people and protect the artworks, but understanding the building just as a background for the public space, which was somehow what helped us to understand how to compose this building. Because the idea of composing this area, the square, is the idea that obliged us to extend the building as much as possible, to understanding it almost as a wall, as a kind of gallery, like the Uffizi gallery, somehow composed using our language, of course. I mean, I'm sure most of us, we are architects. I mean, each one has a different language. Each one has a different way of understanding architecture. In this case, for us, this idea of finding an element that could introduce, I mean, this idea of rhythm, like in the train tracks, an element, a material that could be linked with the surroundings, trying to play somehow with the way we were opening the building in an expressive way, and using somehow something that could be linked with the memory of the site. Because as I said before, we were demolishing the pre-existence because we thought that the city, it was a main topic and we needed to demolish that building. But we didn't want to demolish the memory of the site. And that's why we kept some key elements for us, key elements that could help us to compose the new building. We wanted to use the idea of using the memory of the site instead of using the physical fact that we discovered in the site. And that's why, for example, we decided to keep one of the main elements of the warehouse, that was this volume facing the south. That's why we decided to keep some of the train tracks, some of the materials that we found inside the plot. We wanted to use the traces of what we found in order to define our own traces. And that was somehow this idea of memory. That was something that helped us to understand the language of our building. Somehow what we found is what defined the language of the building. And that's why we decided to keep, I mean, all the elements that we found, as I said before, within the plot, all the elements that already existed, that were part of the city, but that were hidden somehow by the warehouse. And the building appears, when you think about it from this perspective, appears just as a, yeah, as I said, as a background for this, for the city itself. I mean, appears as an element that tries just to compose, I said background, but a new reality, let's say. I mean, because people is rediscovering this place. I mean, the people, the citizens are using somehow the ideas that they could use somehow this space, even without the need of going inside the building, inside the museum. And that's what made the building more, and from our point of view, more understandable, because it was not just about the object, as I said, it was about this idea of extending the city in this neighborhood and trying to compose and looking back to the city within this neighborhood. And all the decisions inside the building were related with this fact of the public space outside. I mean, this is the ground floor with the main public uses facing the public square. I mean, the small bar, the small auditorium, the bookshop, and space for young artists at the ground floor open directly towards the square. And of course, I mean, the main entrance. All these spaces were just trying to activate the public space in this side, with this idea of composing somehow this this kind of gallery as the reference that I showed you at the very beginning, this gallery that was defined by the public, or this public space defined by the gallery. As I was describing some of the elements that we understood that were part of the memory of the site. This was the warehouse when we visited during the first visit, with this window facing south. An element that we decided to keep and to use it to define as the main element of the building, not because, I mean, we are conscious that, I mean, you can't explain the buildings to the visitors, but we wanted to transmit the idea when they enter the building and they see the foyer and they start to go upstairs and they discover this window, just to start somehow the conversation with them, or I mean, what I hope is that people can wonder why they did this, or why this element is defining the new foyer. And perhaps, I mean, there is a moment where they can relate the memory of the site with the new building, and start thinking that the fact of having a memory of this site was important and was the key element. And it was in Cour. In Cour, the foyer frames the preexistence. In Lausanne, the preexistence defines geometrically the main foyer. And this idea of memory, I think that was somehow, with the idea of rediscover the city, the main two ideas that help us to move forward with the design. A design that then is about somehow, is based in what we, is based on, of course, in the way we understand architecture nowadays, but this idea of exploring somehow the fundamentals. In this case, in Lausanne, how to work with the idea of natural light inside the museum, how to compose spaces that could activate somehow a clear conversation with the artworks, how to use this idea of materiality just to transmit depth and density to spaces that are clearly defined with simple geometries. The idea of use natural light as the thread that guides the visitor, not just at the ground floor, but at the first floor and the second floor, taking the visitor through all the spaces with different, of course, experiences, because nowadays visiting a museum is a question of how to propose most of the times experiences to the visitors too, but trying to use always architecture as an expressive element, but that basically could compose, as in Cour, the best background for the art experience that we could compose, let's say. And that's why, following this idea of composing a gallery, all the rooms appears like in a classic gallery as a sequence of rooms. I mean, this is the level of the permanent galleries. This is a picture of what I was explaining. I mean, this idea of working just with light and with simple elements that could enlighten somehow the spaces. And this is the north facade, and could transmit this idea of, let's say, approach to the basics, to the fundamentals, in order to just having this kind of moments. This is one of the permanent galleries. I mean, where just the architecture provokes this sequence of spaces defined by the light coming from the northern side. Again, another picture of the northern galleries. and finding moments to relate the building within the city, because, well, we have been talking about public space, we have been talking about how the public space define the shape of the building and the language and the nature of the building, this idea of memory and public space. But then the building tries to relate the interior spaces with the exterior, trying to achieve, like in this, this is a small auditorium connecting the first floor with the permanent galleries with the temporary galleries. Well, trying to relate the exterior, I mean, Lausanne, with the experience of the museum. So the building is not just an enclosed box, that introverted element that works within the city completely independent. It's a building that tries to provoke somehow specific views and specific moments towards the city. And of course, with the aim of being expressive, because all what we do, I mean, the architecture that we propose tries to be, of course, expressive, tries to be singular, and tries to rediscover this singularity using the elements that we find in the places where we work, as I said. But of course, I mean, using this language, that this is our own language based on our obsessions and desires, of course, but it's a language that in this case, we understood, that could compose a new quarter of the city in Lausanne. These are the temporary galleries at the second floor. I mean, just again, playing with this idea of being in an industrial place. Why not reinterpret a classic shade? And that's why all the galleries are defined by these shades. By these sheds, sorry. I mean, trying to achieve the best natural light at the second floor. Again, introducing the idea of rhythm, the idea of the repetition of an element, which was rooted in this place. Somehow you think about the train tracks, if you think about the train station, this idea of rhythm, repetition, almost this how to compose something or how to compose an ensemble of things. It's something that for us, it was somehow part of the essence of this plot. This peak of the temporary galleries at the second floor, and this sequence that introduces again this what I was saying before. I mean, this idea of rhythm. Again, second floor, temporary gallery, and outside. The materiality of the building with, I mean, in this case, this was solved with clinker. I mean, this great texture that basically it appears like an element that links somehow the building with the exterior, with the textures that we found in this neighborhood, that proposes somehow this approach to a handmade surface that establishes somehow a more personal and more irregular, I mean, lecture of the building, and that establishes somehow an atmosphere within the site. Because, well, this idea of atmosphere and how to relate the building within this particular plot is another topic that is a second level of discussion probably, but it's another topic that makes the building makes the building somehow or transmit that the building belongs somehow better to the place than just the physical fact of how to dispose the building within the plot. Lausanne was a reflection about the city as a corpus somehow. At the beginning, I was talking about this word palimpsest, but Lausanne was a classical sample somehow from us, just about the city as a physical fact. I mean, how to move pieces, how to demolish something, how to generate a void, how to use it as a public space, how to understand the public space within this neighborhood. It was a palimpsest of physical facts. But we had another experience, and was this experience that Ute was explaining at the beginning when she was introducing the lecture. That was the extension of the Tanzhaus Zurich, where for us, I mean, was another kind of, let's say, another kind of palimpsest, where it was not just about physical facts that we discovered at the place where we had to work. It was about all these elements that somehow are characterizing a place and that somehow make your project something unexpected. And I'm going to explain why something unexpected. This is a view of not of the site. This is a view of the neighborhood of where we had to extend the Tanzhaus. I mean, the plot is on the south of this. It's on the right side here, where I have the mouse somehow. But this is, I mean, our neighborhood. This is Zurich. Zurich, I think it's an amazing place because for most of us, I mean, probably Zurich is just about the lake, the luxury streets, I mean, lawyers, banks, and business. But there are, Zurich still keeps some neighborhoods like this one, characterized, of course, in this case, I mean, not just by the Limmat, by the river, but in this case, this is the Kloster Fahrbeck. I mean, this bath canal that appears on the right side, and it's characterized by these textures. Somehow, I mean, the bridge over the river for the trains, this industrial mood that characterizes somehow this view. Here at the back appears, I mean, the grain silo that you are going to see later. But somehow this was the atmosphere of the site that we had, where we had to work. We were working with an atmosphere somehow. And this is what we proposed, this is the model of the competition. Basically, we had to do the extension of this building. This is an office building, but half of the building, approximately half of the building, it was the Tanzhaus itself, and we had to do the extension of this building. Basically, we had to do a small theater for 150 people and 3 studios for dancers, and some offices and all the secondary uses related with the dancers. I mean, small wardrobes and some technical space services. At the back, this volume, this is a housing building, which is basically somehow as important as the extension. It was as important as the extension. And this building on the right side, it's the third member of the family, let's say, and this is elementary school, which was in this site. When you approach to this site as an architect, I mean, somehow it was clear what we had to do. No, we were in front of the river in front of us here. It's easy to discover that, well, we had to link somehow the road with the pathway here, just close to the river here. I mean, there was a very small pathway. This was a very degraded area before us. There was an old warehouse here. I mean, and we were at the very beginning rediscovering somehow these physical facts, how to link the roads with the pathway, how to make the pathway bigger, how to connect them through staircases, or how to link somehow the path with the bridge. There is a viaduct here that crosses over the Limmats and connects this side of the neighborhood with the other neighborhood. And somehow we knew how to do that. And the brief proposed to use this plot with some freedom, let's say. I mean, we could compose a higher volume, but basically what we wanted to do is to understand that our building was just the element that put all these three volumes together, let's say. So this intervention is about this word, how to be together, let's say. The elementary school, the housing, and the offices and the townhouse. These four uses, 2 private uses, 2 public uses, housing and the offices, the townhouse and the elementary school. And we were the fourth somehow volume. So instead of trying to compose a new object, an element that could attract somehow new sites to the site, we just defined the site through 2 simple walls, this one and this one. And what we proposed was basically a space for being together, a garden. We just wanted to provoke a space where the kids, the families, the employees of the offices could share some moments and could rediscover somehow the neighborhood. And we started to think about, when designing, we started to think about, well, how these people could get profit of this space. I mean, people from the housing, how during lunchtime, people at the offices could just be together, having a sandwich in front of the river, how they could play with the kids when they exit the school and they go to this belvedere or to the upper part of the garden, just for, I mean, playing together, how to rediscover this word together that was really very important for us when designing. And of course, doing this in a very specific way, I mean, with these 2 walls. I mean, the walls appeared characterized by these triangular shapes, basically because as most of us as architects, basically it was something that we liked when we did it, and because it's based on our backgrounds and our desires as architects or in our obsessions. But then because it was clear for us that within these neighborhoods, the buildings should appear almost like, in order to match the building with the atmosphere of the site, the buildings should look almost like another infrastructure. I mean, we wanted to keep this, we wanted to preserve this idea of industrial character of the place, a place defined by almost infrastructures like the bridges, the viaduct. We wanted to be another bridge somehow. And that's why we defined these walls in this way, of course, keeping all the, I mean, technical rules and needs that we had, in this case, facing south. These facades are facing south, so 50% of the surface had to be closed, 50 open. Then we had to deal with what to do with the openings. But well, and doing this in a way that could be understood as an expressive element. It's a public building, so it needs to provoke something, needs to provoke an attraction somehow. Doing it, keeping this idea of atmosphere or character, I mean, understanding it almost as a infrastructure, doing it in a personal way, and in a way that could be related somehow with the use. And this is, well, perhaps this is again somehow it's naive to explain it in this way, but I used to say that somehow we had to do a couple of walls, but these walls shouldn't be the same than others. I mean, we were doing the extension for a dance house. So basically the idea of how to relate with gravity, how to touch the ground, how to introduce the idea of rhythm, the idea of movement should be different with our walls than in other cases. And a couple of walls then establishes the relationship with the river, with the greenery that appears in front of us, and that tries to transmit all these concepts I was explaining in a very straightforward way. I mean, the building appears defined just by a single material, most of the building is defined just as a single material concrete, where things just happen very straightforward. As I said, in this case, the window frames, the touching the concrete, clearly a section that was defined by the needs of every single space. I mean, it was another important word for us in this project. I mean, to do just what was needed. I mean, not adding more than what was needed. And that's why the building steps back in order to reduce the volume of the lobby and introducing this public belvedere above the lobby. We weren't trying to find a huge lobby or a huge public space. We wanted to, a huge interior space, sorry, we wanted to provoke public space better than huge interior space. And trying to achieve this expressivity I was describing from a certain distance, and blending somehow the architecture with the nature of the place too. And this idea of blending somehow the architecture with the nature is something that appeared somehow in an unexpected way when thinking about the openings, thinking about how to protect the building from the solar radiation when we were facing south. And that's why we introduced this idea of nature as a way to protect during the spring and summer the interiors from the solar radiation using plants and flowers, and how to gain radiation during the winter and autumn with the same system. And this idea of reintroducing nature, using an infrastructure, keeping the character of the site, trying to achieve an element that could be blended with the surrounding, and provoking and proposing a new public space, it was somehow all the concepts and all the ideas that we tried to put over the table when designing the building. The building appears, as you can see here, as a counterbalance with the grain silo that characterizes this area of Zurich. Appears almost as another infrastructure that blends the building within the neighborhood, that somehow keeps this idea of industrial character that the neighborhood defines, but most of all proposes a new public space on top of it, on top of the building. I mean, this is the view from the garden. The garden just rediscovers the city, just look back to the city, proposes a new view from this place towards the city, and proposes a place just for being together. That was one of the main mottos of this competition. And inside, everything is solved in the simplest way, let's say. I mean, just a hall, the main hall, I mean, this double height, this is the first level, so some offices and some wardrobes for the dancers in order to mix them because they were together. So mix them both instead of splitting them inside the building, mixing them at this level, trying to gain advantage of using the belvedere facing the river at this level. I mean, at the back, you can see the elementary school. This is this kind of belvedere, this terrace overlooking the river. Inside, understanding the windows as the elements that are going to define all the private spaces. I mean, every window somehow it's different because of the way we introduce nature, the number of cables, of the way the plants are growing up in each window, it's different. So the way the light enters the building is a little bit different. Again, light, scale, proportion is on the basis of this proposal too. And at the ground floor, just the foyer, opening up as much as possible the foyer towards the pathway in order to activate the pathway. And in a very simple way, composing somehow these three studios and the main hall as a sequence of rooms that basically organizes everything in a very functional way, but having in mind always this idea of need, just doing what is necessary. This is a view of the foyer, the main entrance. I mean, the idea of the light characterizing the space, the light that changes season by season, along the day, day by day, proposing in a space that changes and that moves, somehow linked with this idea of dancing. The interior space is characterized by light. This is one of the rehearsal studios. Or, for example, it happens exactly the same at the main hall. I mean, this room for 150 people, devoted basically for dancing, where everything appears natural and simple, but where, as in the other rooms, everything has a reason and everything has a need. I mean, there are no orthogonal angles in order to relate the building, to deal with acoustics inside all the rooms, try to transmit this idea of simplicity and in a way that can be felt, even being conscious that the build nowadays is not simple and that nothing is as simple as it appears somehow. But what I mean, again, light, rhythm, this gesture that defines somehow the walls, the idea of the wall, in order to compose this new reality when facing the building from outside. And a building that basically composes somehow a landscape, understanding that somehow when you deal with these specific places, well, every place is specific, every place, as I said, is singular and unique. But when you deal with them, sometimes it's not just about the physical facts. I mean, how to link the road with the pathway, how to connect them, how to control the volume, it's about something that is linked with the character, with the atmosphere, and with concepts as sorry for insisting, as this idea of being together, which basically is the main reason for composing cities, for being together. And this is something that we discovered in Zurich. We discovered as architects in Zurich, that sometimes that's just the main concept, being together. So thank you. I think that was all my reflections today about city and public space and how to relate within the city. And well, I would be really happy if we can talk about it between all of us, not between all of us, but with some of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alberto. That was nice, and we will try to engage with as much as possible people from the crowd, kind of listening. Just have to ask quickly to Lorenz, but also the collaborators. Is there something in the chat we already can reply on? Seems not. We have now back on stage also, or again, let's say for the visitors, kind of listeners, kind of new on stage, Mike Nowotny. Hello, Mike. Nice to see you again.
Hello.
And thanks again to Alberto. It was interesting kind of to see now, the selection you presented, 3 sites in Switzerland. And already when I saw the range, I would like to raise a question about, let's say, the experience, because you work in several kind of European, but also globally, also in the United States, what I see now. And what is, let's say, for you, let's say, the difference, or let's say, working in Switzerland or elsewhere? But I will also then like to come back later, because the place you kind of, the Tanzhaus he presented now at the end, I know the place pretty well, because I have the luxury to work in one of these offices of the existing dance house building. And we can maybe then also chat later about this public space. But I really would like to know, because it was just interesting now seeing 3 projects in Switzerland and your approach to the public space, how you also experience it in the 3 different cities, because I think it's, I know the site in Lausanne as well, pretty well, it's very close to the station. but it was a blind spot, so to say, within the city, and now reactivated kind of, it's really on one of the hotspots of the city.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, the fact of showing just three buildings in Switzerland, it was coincidental because I think it were the best samples I had at the office. I mean, well, it's true that during the last year, Switzerland has been our home, let's say, because we have worked there in these three buildings. But I mean, it's true that these three cities are completely different. I mean, Switzerland, it's a palimpsest of different things, and all the cantons are different. But our approach to not just in Switzerland, but in all the opportunities we had in London, in Spain, in Italy, in the United States, we try to. I mean, this idea of public, or this idea of how to react within the city or with the public space, it's always the same. There's no difference for us. I mean, we don't work in countries, we don't work in cities, we just work in plots, in very, very specific sites, you know. And the attitude you have as architects, or the attitude we try to have always as architects, always is the same, is what you believe in. I mean, we believe in this case that we need to define the buildings, always thinking about what's around us and about the public space, about the city. And we start the conversation inside the office thinking about it. I mean, we don't start thinking about the program, we don't start thinking about abstract concepts. We start just thinking about what's around us. Most of the times is just about the city. And then when you start thinking, you discover that all the places are not the same, of course, and the attitudes are not the same. The attitudes of I mean, it's not the same working in Switzerland and working in Italy or in Spain, where, I mean, the climate is different, or where the character is different, the character of the people is different. But I mean, the basics are the same, no? And I think that this idea of, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, a bit ridiculous, but this idea of being together, I mean, it's so simple, but it's that's just human nature, no? And when you think about it from that perspective, you already have a concept, no? And
yeah. But that's visible in a way, you know, that kind of, let's say, that this being together, or this connectivity between different kind of, let's say, human beings, and that you have this always kind of, let's say, in mind if you're designing this one thing, but there's also something about this being together of the different elements or objects that create a bigger piece. And I think that this was very obvious from the early beginning, kind of in the Tanzhaus in Zurich, but also I think it's also within the relation you build up with the Villa Planta of the Kunst, the old building of the Kunsthaus in Chur and the new one, and trying to look into a being together of different kind of, let's say, building an ensemble, I would say, with that and looking very much what I very often call kind of the key, let's say, focus point of an urban design aspects, but you do that in your architectural settings as well, looking very much to the in-between that creates this togetherness.
Yeah, well, and it's very interesting what you say about this in-between, no? Because sometimes to work in a place, to read the place and the characteristics of the place, it's not about looking at the main history of the place, nor looking about the main facts. It's about to understand this in-between places, or in-between histories, the intra-histories that you can discover in the places where you work. And this is something that it's very important, when, at least for us as architects. And then what comes later, I mean, what comes later means how to deal physically with the surroundings, how to deal with the program, how to deal with the scale, your own language, how to deal with your ego as architect. That's secondary somehow, no? That comes later. But I think that focusing, or at least for us, is very helpful. Focusing the main attention about this topic of how to relate with the city at all the places where you work in a very specific way, in a very singular way. I mean, not trying to solve the city, not trying to solve, just trying to solve or not solve, trying to improve that particular place is our main task. And being conscious that you are not the last one. We never were the first ones working in a place, and we are not the last ones working in a place. And that, I think that's very important to highlight. I mean, we are very conscious that we are always doing extensions or doing refurbishments or doing something that somebody did before us, and we are just another layer. We are just another period of time in all the places where we work. Can be 15, 50, or 100 years, but we are just another layer. So that helps us always to think about what to do, because we are not the last ones. We are not the endings of the places where we work.
There was one aspect, or actually one word, which kept coming up in your lecture, which I found interesting, and it was language, which of course, as an architecture journalist, I was quite curious or found interesting, because you mention it quite often. And I was interested in sort of in this, let's say, narrative aspect of your architecture. If you decide in the specific side what kind of language you use, how important is the aspect of legibility? How understandable is this language to the people around? Because I mean, it's not really architecture parlance. It's not super literal, but you use certain elements from the site or from the surroundings, or maybe from the history of a place. And then I had the idea that sort of balances between an abstraction of these ideas and something which is tangible or legible. But maybe you could talk a little bit about what is your idea about language and storytelling in architecture.
Yeah, well, language, I think it's about, well, basically it's about, I mean, it's going to sound very basic, but it's about what you like. No, it's about, I mean, we are full of obsessions and desires as architects, and we try to transmit them in all what we do, because all of us, we have a personal approach to architecture. No, so when you talk about language in your architecture, you're talking about things that are related basically with you, and that we try to confront that with existing, and we try to use the existing in order to have different approaches in terms of language. And so we work with the context. We believe in context, and we try to use elements that we find in the context. As in this case, for example, in Zurich, the triangular shapes, of course, is something that we like, that belongs to our own obsessions. But you find this kind of geometries if you look with attention to what is surrounding you, to the bridges, to the viaduct. You discover these kind of geometries. So it's something that is rooted with existing. And of course, as we try to be expressive with what we do, most of the times we use the geometry and abstraction in order to synthesize somehow the final picture and to transmit things with what we do. Because we try to be expressive with what we do because we want to transmit things. It's true that it's not legible. I mean, you can't explain what you do to the citizens, and sometimes, well, of course you can't explain it, but we hope, or we have the aim, that they can feel somehow some attraction, or that they can understand the buildings that they see somehow rooted were the places that they are experiencing. I hope that the people visiting the townhouse, they can understand that, well, the space is comfortable, the garden is nice. Oh, look, they use triangular windows. Well, these are not so bad because, well, somehow makes sense what we're looking at here. No, but it's just, you transmit feelings, but you can't transmit certainties because, I mean, the language belongs to you, and the language, in this case, is our language, but each architect has a different language. And that's the beauty of this profession. 1,000 different answers can be the right answer. And that's why architecture and cities are so interesting, because there's the right answer for each place. No. Well, I mean, very messy my speech, but what I mean, I was trying to justify that we try to adapt our obsessions to the context using what we find in the context as an element to solve somehow the gestures or the expression of the buildings.
What I find interesting in a way, let's say there is a clear architectural language, or you call it also an obsession. Okay, for instance, triangular shapes, kind of, you also had this in Fingermaloko and Szczecin, but let's say the triangular, it's always, and you mentioned this also several times, kind of, let's say and the title is also, of your lecture is also palimpsest, kind of this, what I really like is this notion of we are just another layer. And what is interesting in a way in this kind of, let's say, searching for also simplicity, what you also said, kind of just doing what is necessary. Let's say, or what is necessary, kind of being visible, and what can be maybe even somewhere else or hidden. Because I think I never saw this kind of V shapes as triangular, but more this alliteration of, let's say, infrastructural buildings. And for a lot of people, this facade, if they are not crossing the viaduct, it's not even visible. Mm-hmm. So let's say from the street, the building, the only thing of the only exposure of the building is the core of the lift. Yeah. And everything else is below. So it's really literally this kind of two worlds, let's say, that kind of step down. Which I think that was also necessary for the ensemble, because this whole thing is under kind of protection. But I think I found also the alliteration, what you said, kind of in a way that the infrastructure building of the silo, which was not under construction when you started, or kind of working on the competition, is in a way, one is the skyscraper, and the other one is the ground scraper, which is interesting, but it's really, let's say, to work with this kind of elements of infrastructure, bridge elements, kind of pillars, columns that kind of just need to bring literally, let's say, the load down is very, and also kind of touches a certain Swissness, or maybe even Zurichness, kind of this Zwinglianism in a way. It's interesting on that. But I had one when I saw first, let's say, for instance, because I know it from images, but if you when you showed the pictures of the Lausanne, of the Musée Beaux-Arts in Lausanne, I thought, on one hand, it's the translation and the transformation of elements that are existing, and you put another layer on it, and there I thought, so, oh, the scale is really, which is in the Tannhausen scales, but also in Kuhnert scale, is this still touching, let's say, the human scale you normally touch in all your projects? But let's say it was then visible with kind of this getting closer with let's say, the translation into materialization, kind of the brick elements also. So it doesn't look that kind of huge then anymore. But I think this is really something pretty interesting in that way of that you always try to follow your, let's say, obsessions or language, but also really inscribing it into a context. And even till the ornaments, kind of to looking always into something that is going into a dialogue with what's there, till the geometry of the villa, La Planta. Mm-hmm. So there's always a dialogue with what's there strongly.
Yeah, this is, it's completely true. At least what we try to do is to establish this dialogue. And I don't know why I appeared this word today at this bit. I mean, in this lecture. I mean, the word obsessions. When I use it just to describe somehow this personal approach to something, and trying to find a link with existing. No, I mean, how to mix them. I mean, and somehow this is something that's you need to balance always. No? I mean, for example, in Zurich, I mean, it's true that we wanted to do a kind of infrastructure. We wanted to do an element that could, even we didn't know that the grind silo was a silo. We thought that it would be a skyscraper. I mean, we didn't know that was a silo, but we wanted somehow to do something that could be related with this site, and using a language. In this case, well, these are triangles, but could be whatever. I mean, could be for others, could be whatever. It could be just a beam, but somehow it's something that we found there, but at the same time belong to this our personal approach to this sense of geometry and to do just something, just trying to do what is needed. I mean, that was. But that's something that belongs to our corpus as architects. We believe in that, and that's why we thought that was the right answer.
Because what you mentioned also once, and I think this is also interesting to look at it in that way, kind of the building. The building should be the building as a background for the public, and the buildings as a background for the city. Which I think, let's say, that this is exactly this link between what I also very often think is missing that in certain kind of cultures, or this missing link between architecture and urbanism, or the public realm, in a way to, and then the bigger ensemble, or the bigger whole. Because if we think about, and I think that's really nice about kind of looking at that a building is a background for, let's say, the public, for the city, but also for being together or getting together. Then I think we would, if this is something we can train each architect in, kind of, I think there will be only buildings that kind of engage with context.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned this word urbanism, and I think that this is some of the challenges that we need to face as architects and urbanists. I mean, sometimes we think that urbanism is just related with the city, and architects are just related with the buildings, and no one thinks about how to relate with people and how to relate with I mean, with a smaller scale, no, somehow. I mean, some of them are composing backgrounds for cities, some of them composing just, I mean, the general infrastructure, no? And I think that is, I mean, something that all of us should do is to mix both scales. I mean, when you do something that needs to relate all the scales that you find in a place. I mean, you need to solve, I mean, as in Zurich, you need to solve the view from the other side of the river, and you need to do something that makes sense with the three buildings that are at the back. But then you need, I mean, the building just solves small topics like a pathway, I mean, a staircase, how to open an office, how to make people curious when they cross the pathway and look into the building and they want to enter because they are curious about it, how to relate with the sun, with the face in the south. I mean, it's not about just the bigger scale of the site. It's about all these small histories that you were mentioning at the beginning. I mean, that's making architecture.
But the interesting thing, for instance, because very often there are also rules kind of that don't allow to open up, let's say, this to provide these public spaces. I'm just curious, for instance, in Zurich, the discussion with the school, because we have in several kind of other cities or countries, and we just had, I think last time, kind of after the last presentation, or even the one of Fleischlowitz, we had a discussion kind of how open a school can be, let's say, and whether you have, what kind of terrain do you need to fence around it and what needs to be protected, because I think, let's say, the space there, let's say the first terrace that's kind of looking from the river. Let's say you have there's the pathway along the river, and there's the first platform that unites, so to say, the terrace of the dance house, of their offices, back offices, and so on. And that is also accessible by both staircases on both sides, but this kind of floats directly over in the schoolyard, so to say. Was there at all a discussion at the time kind of with the school or with, let's say, the city in relation to that needs to be protected, and because there, let's say, different uses float and completely into each other, and I think that's the interesting thing about it.
Well, Ute, it's Switzerland and it's Zurich, so you know better than me that we had all type of discussions with the users, with the city, regarding how to mix flows, how to protect, how to have security. Well, somehow we found an in-between solution. No, let's say, I mean, it's true that at the very beginning we thought that everything could be much more open. Even, I mean, even everything could be more flexible. But we found somehow a solution that makes a certain degree, sorry, a certain degree of freedom when you move around the site, and a certain degree of security. But I mean, at least everybody understood that it was very important to provoke an open space at the garden, an open space at the Belvedere where people could meet. I mean, the message was so basic that when we started to talk with everybody understood it, and everybody did their own assumptions about it, and everybody renounced it to something. The people from the housing, they assume certain restraints, they renounced it to something. The people from the school, they renounced to something, thinking about the common benefits. So it's not just about us and an idea, it was about the work of the talkings with all the neighbors and with the city hall in order to convince them to do that, and to understand that as a public, really public space, and not just as a private space surrounded by a fence that could be used.
The core thing about public sharing. It's open for everybody. That's the essence of. If we just have a question, as far as I can see, we got a question in the chat. It's more globally. Let's say there's an architect. What advice would you give to a young architect?
To be patient and to be optimist. No, no, I think it's, I mean, no, it's true. I mean, to be patient, because, well, I think, well, in my experience, when I meet with students, most of them, they have somehow this kind of pressure of getting something as soon as possible. And because that's what's around us as society nowadays, no? Try to get something very quick and very as soon as possible. And so that's why I think that it's a good advice, that's to be patient. I mean, things can happen during the next 5 years or during the next 50 years or 60 years. So you never know. And to be optimist, because, I mean, nowadays, I mean, mostly nowadays, I mean, fear is a word that crosses all our minds. I mean, we are full of fear about everything. So I think we need to be optimists, and we need to think that things are moving forward just for the better of us. And an architect has a huge responsibility in making things better. And that's why I think it's very important having students, having architects thinking that things can be better. And that's why I think, for me at least, are two good advices: being optimist and being patient. And I know the third one would be that, I mean, there's plenty of work in this world for architects. Sometimes what you have to do is just to find the right place. I mean, perhaps it's not your city or your country or your neighborhood, but it can be another country, another place, another city, or another continent. I don't know.
That is something that interests me also, and I asked also the other speakers, because I think that informs your work as well, kind of, because you work in different cultural contexts, in different cities, in different countries, and you also, let's say, you also work, your partner is also coming from a different culture, kind of, it's close, but still, let's say, how does this kind of working in different cultural contexts, even if you showed today it's 3 Swiss projects, but projects in Switzerland, but how does this work in different cultural contexts inform your work and this, let's say, maybe openness also to other solutions?
Yeah, our office, well, your office is much bigger, I mean, but probably it's very similar to yours. I mean, we are 25 people most of them are for different countries. We are like, probably we have like 8, 9 countries, different countries inside the office. And for each one, things are different always. The perspectives are completely different. It's like it's like when you see, I mean, the scenes at the back of a movie, no? I mean, different angles of the camera just shows you completely different things. And that's what is really interesting inside our office. And that's what is really interesting when you have the chance of working abroad in different places, in different countries, or even in different continents currently. You have, you know, having a chance of having different opinions and perspective about things makes you reconsider what's important for you. And when you have the time to do that, that's very important, because you start having principles somehow, because there are things that you believe in, and you need to have things to believe in. And in my case, I think I got them because I have discussed with many people about things from different perspectives. So that's why now, coming back to the main topic of today, the importance of the public space, I don't question myself about it when I start working in other places. I mean, for me, I believe in that. I don't need to think about it. And so that's one of the benefits of working in different places and working with different people with different perspectives. Of course, makes the process very rich and whatever, but mainly obliged you to be sure about what you believe in as architect and as a human being, of course, but as architect in this case.
That's a strong belief, and translate this into different kind of, let's say, some different kind of projects. Yeah. But that's clear that strong belief in the public realm and in the common ground, I think, is imminent in your work.
Yeah. Or at least until now. I mean, let's see the future. But no, I mean, this is something that I think is gonna shape continuously the way we work.
Let's have a look to the chat as well. Again, no more questions from the YouTube. Mike, do you have still a question?
Yeah, one maybe slightly heretic question about what we're talking about the aspect of public space or public uses, because the projects you showed with 2 museums and the dance house, and also the many projects which you're famous for or known for, public buildings. So they are typologically special. There's a public use imminent in them. So I was wondering if your approach would be different for different typology, which is sort of more like housing or offices, which is not special, but which is part of the general fabric of the city. So would you approach it completely differently, or is it the same?
Well, I don't think so. Well, in fact, we have tried it. I mean, we have done competitions for housing projects. I mean, but we lost. Well, because we need to learn how to do housing too. I mean, it's not as easy as it could look. But I think the approach is the same, but probably in a different scale. Probably is about how to understand, I mean, the private and the public, and using terraces, using porches, using the entrances, using the way the neighbors are relating to each other, how mixing the community life inside the buildings. Or at least this is what we tried. So I think that we had the same approach. So it's not just about it. I think in our case, it's not about the typology. It's about really to have a strong narrative for the building. And this, most of the times we find this strong narratives thinking about public and private. I mean, when you do housing, it's about finding a narrative between public and private. It's different than a museum, of course, because a museum, everything is guided by the idea of public. But in a housing project, I mean, this idea of private and public and the blurred areas between both is what is going to define this typology during the next decades. I mean, because this is going to probably, if we start to look at competitions and buildings on site nowadays, most of them are related with this idea of how to propose areas that can be public and private, or how to blur the limit between the privateness of the house and the publicness of the communal spaces. So I think it's our approach. I think it would be somehow similar, always looking for a strong narrative for the buildings. I mean, and I think that's this idea of public and private. It would be really an engine of thinking for us.
It would probably just work on a slightly different scale, or maybe on a smaller scale, but with the same principles. Because in all the few projects you showed today, there was this sort of, just in terms of spaces, interlocking of inside and outside, like in Lausanne, where you have the view from the auditorium towards the city, or when you have this view through. I mean, this is just space. This can work in any typology.
It's a question of scale. But I mean, when talking about the scale or dimensions, there's a sample that I like a lot. That are these Moai sculptures at the Pascua Island in Chile. These sculptures just facing the horizon. I mean, it's about the attitude of what you do. It's not about. I mean, when you see those sculptures, they are looking to the horizon, and I mean, they are much more powerful than the ocean. I mean, it's about the attitude of the sculptures. And so it's about the attitude that you do. It can be just in a small balcony, 2 by 2 square meters, or it can be just in a staircase. And it's not related with the scale. It's related with the narrative of the building and the attitude. And there are amazing projects of housing, which, I mean, Switzerland is a great sample. I'm sure in Austria there are great samples too of housing projects that just show an attitude towards this topic of public and private, declaring somehow what is the right thing to do, basically.
Another piece of good advice for young architects. It's about the attitude.
It's about the attitude, yeah. No, sure, but it's also about let's say something you believe in. Let's say this strong. That's kind of you build your narrative around. I think this is strongly, let's say, related to the public. Now, I think it was pretty clear. Let's say the strong vision, and I think it's also, let's say, because you said obsession, but also this obsession kind of you have in your work, kind of to link the public and the. To link the inside to the outside, and what happens within a building, whether it's now public or private, to the space and the impact it has in the city context, in the urban fabric. I think that is came pretty clearly out. It was I think, do we have questions still from the chat now? Let's say that's the disadvantage, I think, from screening, that let's say there's such a we had a talk prior we started kind of today. I checked with Alberto kind of that it's sure we miss, let's say, this informal kind of, and also different layers of communication within the online presentation, which is really a pity. But I think we had let's say we had a really good insight in your work. Thank you very much, and thanks a lot. And I also learned quite some other aspects of your work now today, which was also very, very nice. And I hope, let's say, you have a place like I have now, you built kind of can go down quickly, maybe for a drink next to the house, let's say, looking to the river, which is really an enormous, let's say, luxury. And maybe to everybody listening still, let's say this intervention of the Tanz House, because let's say there was a building also on the same scale, let's say studios that kind of just burned down several years ago, where I got a call on Saturday morning, very early, our office is burning. Luckily it was site. But let's say the change it made to, let's say, the sense of the place and kind of how people use the space is completely different, because that was at the time a roof. not accessible, black roof. Luckily that kind of turned out with this competition and this kind of nice project, kind of that there are so many layers of publicness, so to say. Really, the above public terrace is public. The second one is semi-public because it belongs to Tanzhaus and the school. So you can access, but you already feel that this is more or less controlled, or let's say more private. And people behave like that. But that was also very obvious during the pandemic. This space was used heavily, especially during the lockdown. And I just told kind of Alberto this early on, that with the takeaways around kind of a pizzeria that's alongside the street, that kind of had a really enormous a takeaway kind of business lounge. You could buy everything there kind of during the lockdown, kind of that was not available in a supermarket, but for sure also very good pizza and drinks. And people, let's say the whole terrace was crowded with these people, and the need of this public spaces and this kind of spaces where people just can come together, sitting in small groups, because they were only allowed to sit there with 5 people. And we had then also kind of, because we were also inside not allowed to make, let's say, big gatherings, and we did it then outside on the terrace. And one of my colleagues, Miriam, said, hey, we have to be careful. We are only allowed to gather with 5 people. So we are now much more, and then we kind of spread, in groups of 5 people, kind of to be capable to still kind of being together. And I think that space kind of allows a lot of different ways of being together, which is a very nice asset and added value to the city of Zurich and our office, I have to admit. So I'm spoiled by that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for this opportunity for talking about the relationship between city and architecture. And well, I mean, it was a pity not sharing this moment with you in person. I mean, but well, at least it's a way to be together online, at least.
Yes, I will, exactly. So we will kind of try, let's say, just catch up when you're in Zurich, and come along, kind of, where our door is, next to the lift of the dance house. And let's say as soon as possible, we take a drink somewhere over there. Would be nice.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for attending this conversation, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Alberto, have a very nice evening. See you soon. Bye-bye.